Hi guys. Okay. I need to get. Oh my god. Oh. Okay. 4 point. זה אני חושב. כאן. כאן. לא. Okay. No, that's pretty bad. אני חושב שזה כאן. Let's try the other direction. What if we go on? Oh, but let's see. זה כאן אני חושב. לא, אני בדקתי אותו. Why is FC? Okay, that's Aruba. פעם הראשונה זה היה נשמע כאן. אוקיי. Oh, nice. Ramaswamy. How do I do it? Wait, there might be a better way. Let me try my old strat. I go, like, you get max round time. Round time? Oh, that's not. Bro, let's go get this. Let me try the between. I wonder what it is to. Yeah, I think I know, but pretty weird. Okay, it's there. Just pretty hard. Okay, that's how you want. So, okay, not that bad, but from a swamp. It's a Karama swamp. Karama swamp. Oh, literally that didn't go that bad. Karama swamp. I mean, okay, this is one video.
If you want to push.
What if I told you this dish was actually healthy? Let's be real, Factor's menu is way healthier than the competition.
One of the central controversies of the war just was it something that could have been won or not. And a lot of historians, especially on the left, will say, no, you could never have won it. Yes, the Americans have air power, artillery. The North Vietnamese don't have these things. And so it is very one side. In fact, that will be the general pattern. So they take crippling losses at the hands of American and South Vietnamese forces. They commit some terrible strategic blunders. This was not a foregone conclusion that it was going to end the way it did.
Hollywood's dramatizing things.
It is,
wow.
Yes. Hollywood hasn't done a very good job on Vietnam. There's still, I think, a pretty strong feeling among the troops that this is something worth fighting for. There is also this growing realization that the politicians are tying our hands behind our back. We either need to fight this war hard or we need to get out.
This episode is sponsored by our friends at Hillsdale College. Right after this episode, go check out their incredible online courses, which are absolutely free at hillsdale.edu/trigger.
Mark, welcome to Trigonometry.
Great to be with you.
Great to have you on. We're going to talk about the Vietnam War. And as we discussed before we started, both the two of us and quite a lot of people watching this might not know very much about that war, but we feel like, you know, some of the conversations that have been happening in American society lately sort of seem to, there seems to be some connection with the things that happened, the conclusions that were made at that time, the impact on the collective psyche of this country. So tell us what happened. What was the Vietnam War? How did it happen? When did it happen? Why did it happen?
Well, that's a great question. And I think if you want to understand the roots of this war, you have to go back at least to 1949. And that's when the Chinese communists won the Chinese Civil War, which is an aspect of our history that most people really don't know very well. But it's, you know, one of the most important events of the 20th century. And up until that time, you had the Truman administration, a lot of other people claiming that communism isn't really a big deal in Asia. We shouldn't be too worried about it. And, you know, for a while, a lot of people thought Mao was just this nice sort of nationalist who said he was going to be democratic. Finally, when he takes over, suddenly reality sets in that these communists are actually pretty bad folks who are going to kill lots of people and try to take over the world. And so you see then in 1950, the U.S. starts aiding the French in Indochina, Vietnam, and then the U.S. also goes into Korea to fight the Korean War. And so, you know, a lot of people second guess and kind of forget about these underlying sources, but, you know, I think you've got to fundamentally understand that this is a war against communism, and this is an ideology that killed 100 million people in the 20th century, which, again, relevant today because you now have young people who don't really know the history saying, oh, socialism, communism aren't, you know, really not that big a deal. But Vietnam clearly is aimed at preventing the spread of communism, and particularly Chinese-led communism in Southeast Asia. And so when the French War ends in 1954, and the French just decide they're sick of this, the United States decides it's going to help a new government in South Vietnam as part of the effort to contain communism. Because what almost all the Americans at this time thought was that this so-called domino theory meant that if you lose a place like South Vietnam, the other countries in the region are going to fall. And that will be actually the guiding principle for most of the war.
And so we've got the domino theory, but what people probably don't know as well, Mark, is that America was financing and helping to support the French financially. I mean, they were paying billions of dollars even back then, which was a lot of money. It's a lot of money now, but back then it was even more money.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and you know, initially the United States was not very keen on this French effort because it was in Roosevelt and Truman kind of thought European colonialism is kind of passé and we're not going to support it. But then when they saw this communist threat, they agreed to help the French. And the French also made promises to the Vietnamese that they could have a greater degree of independence. And it's also interesting when you get to 1954 and the French are surrounded at Dien Bien Phu, they come to the Americans and say, can you bomb the communists who have surrounded us? And Eisenhower actually goes to the British and says, we'd like you to join us in sort of an anti-communist coalition. And the British say, well, you know, you didn't help us out in India, so we're not really that keen on helping save the French in Indochina. And so for that reason, the United States holds its hand. Now, it creates an interesting what if. I do think had we bombed, actually, we could have perhaps saved the French, but we didn't really know that at the time. We didn't realize the Viet Minh, the communists as they called themselves, had committed almost their entire army to Dien Bien Phu and were very vulnerable. But again, we didn't know that at the time. So the U.S. then decides we're just going to hold on to the southern half. French leave, and so we support this new government in South Vietnam.
Well, the French surrender once again. What a shocker. So how do we get from this situation, the communists have the north, the American-backed non-anti-communists have the south. How do you get from that to American boots on the ground?
Yeah, so at the beginning, the new president of South Vietnam is Ngo Dinh, a very religious Catholic Vietnamese, and a lot of people don't think he's going to succeed because there's a lot of chaos in the South, but he is able to consolidate power, and the communists initially think they can beat him with just political agitation, but that turns out not to be the case. And so as his regime gets stronger, the communists decide in 1960 to launch an armed insurrection, basically using the techniques of Mao for mobilizing the peasants. And so you have that begins in 1960. Diem regime struggles at first. They start to get their act together in 1962. President Kennedy helps, puts a lot of aid there. Things are going pretty well in 1963.
Bro, I'm doing
All of a
for
sudden, you have what we call the Buddhist
Sorry,
crisis,
yeah.
which is a hugely complicated and convoluted story where supposedly some Buddhists in the population were dissatisfied with the government, and
I've always loved exploring someplace new, which is why I like Google Fi Wireless. They've got more
Oh,
high-speed
British.
plus international destinations than any other major US carrier at no extra cost. So I can see the world without getting my feathers ruffled. Google Fi Wireless. Switch today. Ceviche, por favor.
They say higher education is outdated, irrelevant, but at Grand Canyon University, we shatter the status quo. GCU's online master's degree programs in technology combine hands-on projects with coursework to help you innovate across digital and physical environments.
At GCU, you can learn to use technology with faith, integrity, and purpose.
This is purpose-driven education. Take action. Find your purpose at Grand Canyon University. Visit gcu.edu.
This was all really ginned up, and we know, in fact, communists were helping give the propaganda behind this, but they duped some of the American press into believing them, and so ultimately the U.S. government supports a coup to overthrow President Diem in 1963. And to me, that is a watershed moment in the war, because the war effort suddenly goes off a cliff. Now, a lot of historians have overlooked some of this, but I think it's quite clear. We now know from North Vietnamese sources this is a huge moment. So the South Vietnamese government goes into a tailspin, and then we have Lyndon Johnson come in. Kennedy's assassinated just a few weeks after President Diem.
So you do minimal
Johnson in 1964 is focusing on getting reelected in the 64 election. So everything to him has to be looked at that lens. And so you get to the Tonkin Gulf incidents of August in 1964. What happens is that a couple American destroyers are out on the high seas, and the North Vietnamese attack them, and President Johnson then is confronted with decision what to do. You know, Johnson doesn't want this in the newspaper. This is not something he was hoping for, but now he's confronted with this fact, and so decides he needs to do something. And here we hear him listening to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who is really the architect of the war for both Kennedy and Johnson. What McNamara says is, we need to convey a signal of our intent to the North Vietnamese. And here he's drawing on academic theories about conflict, which are not based in history, which it's really kind of remarkable to how influential these, especially economists, are. But he buys into this theory that we'll use force to communicate. And so they undertake a very limited raid on the North Vietnamese naval base nearby. Now, the North Vietnamese see this, and they take away the very opposite message that the Americans are trying to send. They see Americans just did a little pinprick strike. That must mean they actually are not serious, because if you were serious, you'd hit them really hard. So this leads them to believe that Johnson is going to throw in the towel on Vietnam or not make a big fuss. And then in the election, Lyndon Johnson portrays himself as the peace candidate and says, I'm not going to send American boys to fight wars that Asian boys can fight. And so the North Vietnamese see this and they say, yeah, you know, South Vietnam is now ripe for the taking. It's in big trouble since this coup. And now Lyndon Johnson's saying he's not going to send American troops. So as soon as Johnson wins the election in November '64, North Vietnamese launch an invasion with, for the first time, sending entire North Vietnamese army divisions. Up until this time, they've sent smaller forces recruited in the South. So their plan is...
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Can I pause you for 1 second and just come back to the Gulf of Tonkin incident? Because our friend Joe Rogan, he brings this up as, like, I think when I asked him what his favorite conspiracy is, he said, well, the Gulf of Tonkin is one of them because it was a pretext for war that was false. What's your reading of some of the narratives around that situation?
It is a complicated situation. So there are two reported attacks, and one of those attacks clearly took place because there were bullet fragments found on the American ships. The second one is still kind of a mystery. The Americans at the time, though, did think there was a second attack based on communications intercepts. Now, some of those intercepts may be referred to the first one. Now, what is misleading, and I think maybe what feeds into conspiracy theories, is McNamara deliberately deceives Congress about what's going on. He says this was an unprovoked attack. Now, we know, and this was not known at the time, but at the time U.S. is actually conducting covert operations against North Vietnam, and probably that has something to do with the fact that they attack the American ships. And so McNamara, he comes out as one of the most disreputable people out of all of this, I think. And this is a case where he misled the American people.
Do we know why he did it?
I think he just felt that it might get a little too messy if people knew that there was some gray areas in here, that maybe this was not purely unprovoked aggression. And again, that also would probably look great with the election coming up. But we do know Lyndon Johnson and McNamara, they are already talking about bombing North Vietnam in 1965, even when people are trying to claim that they're not going to send American boys. So there is a great amount of deceit. In fact, Johnson's advisors come to him several times in 1964 and say, we've actually got a pretty bad rap, Democrats, because we had Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt promised they were going to keep us out of war, and then they get us into war, and we could be heading down that road this way. So we may be fighting a war, so you might not want to talk about being the peace guy. But he ignores them and keeps going on this. So it is a rather sorry aspect of the conflict. And
do you think there's any truth to the idea that actually there were some forces that really did want this war to escalate within the American administration at the time?
There are some who see that it's probably going to happen, but there's a big debate between the ones who are in the McNamara camp, who buy into these academic theories, and they think they can kind of keep this as a limited war, and then it's going to continue. Now, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and others in the military say, that doesn't make any sense. If we either need to fight this war hard or we need to get out. And so that undercurrent was running for the next several years. And for the most part, McNamara is the number one guy, so he largely prevails. And so he pushes this idea that we're going to fight a limited conflict rather than, going all out or getting out.
So 1965, when was the moment American boots hit Vietnamese soil?
So the first American troops come ashore in March of 1965. And at that point, the situation is continuing to get worse in the South. And they said Johnson's already thinking about doing some bombing, but he thinks that they can bomb the North, but it's going to kind of keep on a somewhat modest pace. They don't know that this big invasion is coming. So they send these first troops thinking that they're just there to guard American bases. They're not there to actually get into the fighting. What happens then is May of 65, the North Vietnamese, these divisions that are coming from the north, they launch a big offensive. And by June, it's clear that South Vietnam is probably going to fall unless the Americans get in. So in June and July, Lyndon Johnson thinks this over, and will ultimately, in late July, say, okay, you know what? Yeah, maybe I said we weren't going to send boys, but actually we need to send our boys, because otherwise Vietnam's going to fall, and the consequences of that are things that we just don't want to accept. It's too damaging. Again, going back to the domino theory, this is going to lead to the fall of other countries in Asia.
Because when we look at the American... armed forces at that point, you go, this is the most technologically advanced armed forces in the world. This is the richest country in the world. They were up against, let's be fair, a technologically limited Viet Cong. That should be an easy win, shouldn't it?
Yeah, you might think so. And the first battles are very lopsided. The first big one is Operation Starlight in August of 65. And yes, I mean, the Americans have tanks and amphibious vehicles, they have air power, artillery. The North Vietnamese don't have these things, and so it is very one-sided. In fact, that will be the general pattern, but what happens is that the North Vietnamese are able to withdraw when they don't want to fight, or when they're when they're taking too much damage, so they can either go into remote jungles and mountains and hide out, or then go into Laos and Cambodia. And this is one of the problems that actually begins before 1965. There's a big debate in the US over the country of Laos, which is where the Ho Chi Minh Trail will come in existence. And Kennedy, when he's president, he thinks about sending American troops into Laos because in between North and South Vietnam, you have this narrow demilitarized zone, and the North Vietnamese can't easily sneak things across. They tried it and they were stopped. So they decide they're going to go through Laos and build this Ho Chi Minh Trail. And again, some of the US military says, let's go into Laos, cut that Ho Chi Minh Trail. But Kennedy listens to his civilian State Department, and they decide to negotiate neutralization, which means North Vietnamese are supposed to leave and the Americans. But the North Vietnamese, being good communists, violate the agreement, and they keep going in. And so you have an unending supply of equipment and manpower. So the North Vietnamese will take very heavy losses, but they can keep sending stuff down through the Ho Chi Minh Trail and keep things up indefinitely.
We know our audience, and every so often something comes along that we think you'll genuinely want to see. Hillsdale College made a film about the American founding. It's called Revolutionary America. It's narrated by Tom Selleck, and having seen a preview, I think it's something special. The film brings the founding to life through historians who understand what was genuinely at stake. What struck me watching the trailer is how seriously it treats the audience. No editorializing, no revisionism, just the story told properly with the weight it deserves. The American founding is one of the most consequential political experiments in human history. A group of people who had everything to lose decided that some things were worth more than safety, and the world has never been the same since. This film asks what you would have done in their position. This is a theatrical release, not a streaming drop, and it only runs for 3 days, May 31st to June 2nd. Go to hillsdale.edu/revolution. Find a theatre near you and buy your tickets. That address again, hillsdale.edu/revolution. One more time, that's hillsdale.edu/revolution. I read, Mark, and correct me if I'm wrong, that part of the problem for the American forces is that they were very good when it came to offensive maneuvers. Defensive maneuvers, they weren't so good at, and they really didn't know, they weren't very good strategically at that particular point.
Well, and this is also a point of a lot of debate. General Westmoreland, who was at the time, argues that the American forces should concentrate on what he calls search and destroy. So go look for big enemy units, no matter where they are, even if they're in the furthest reaches of the country, in the mountains and jungles. And the South Vietnamese, our partners, they will focus on securing the villages and towns where most of the people live. And this does have the advantage of keeping Americans, for the most part, away from the population, because Americans don't speak Vietnamese. They don't understand the customs. Now, one of the problems is the Vietnamese government this time is in disarray, so they're not very good at this kind of stuff. But the Americans, the search and destroy is also a very interesting topic. Most of these operations, they don't find the enemy. So a lot of people say, well, this was kind of wasteful. But we now know, especially from looking at the North Vietnamese side, that for one thing, they still inflict very heavy losses on the North Vietnamese, because sometimes they do catch them, and that this really keeps the North Vietnamese off balance. And if you were just to let the North Vietnamese run free, they would be able to mount massive attacks, concentrate in overwhelming numbers at a city or a base. And when they are able to do that, the only way you stop them is destroy the city, essentially, which occasionally happens, but for the most part doesn't.
One thing we haven't talked about yet is I think it's quite an important part of this, is, of course, this is a proxy war. And the North Vietnamese are not fighting by themselves. They're getting support from China and also the Soviet Union, right?
Tired of sifting through jobs that don't feel like the right fit? Introducing Indeed Career Scout. Find the job that's right for you.
Oh, find the job for you.
Give me another.
What'd I say about feeding Grandpa Airheads?
Don't do it?
That's correct, yes. And in the early years, China is the main partner. And there's a myth that Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh really were not on good terms with the Chinese. They didn't really like them. That is actually not the case. We do know they were quite close, especially Mao and Ho Chi Minh themselves. Now, there'll be a falling out later, but initially the two of them are quite close to one another. And it goes back to Dien Bien Phu. We know the Chinese had sent 1,000 trucks to help the Viet Minh win there. And so the Chinese do see this as a major front in dominating Asia, pushing the United States out as a major power. But the Soviets are also there, and the Americans know the Soviets and the Chinese aren't on board, but this American intervention actually sort of widens the Sino-Soviet split, because what happens when the Americans come in, the Vietnamese turn to the Soviets for anti-aircraft weapons, because there's so much American air power. And so when they start getting more from the Soviets, the Chinese start getting jealous, and you start to see a falling out. And then you have the Cultural Revolution in China. And so eventually the Soviets will become the principal benefactor of the North Vietnamese.
So 1965, boots on the ground. At the beginning, the Americans were making inroads, high fives all round, kicking commie ass. When did it start to turn?
Well, for the troops themselves, they're still pretty motivated for several years now. Robert McNamara himself starts to become disillusioned at the end of '65, and this is one of the reasons why he's so unpopular, is that he's actually now having doubts, but he's not talking too much about them. So a lot of people say, well, should have maybe resigned, or maybe told people that we got to do something different. But the reason he gets discouraged is that when the troops go in the middle of '65, he is still believing that we have these limited war theories that tell us that one side restrains itself and the other side will restrain itself. Well, the Americans limit themselves, but late next '65, they find out the North Vietnamese are sending in a whole bunch more people, and so this theory has been essentially destroyed. And so now McNamara realizes that it's not going to work, and the war is getting bigger and bigger, and he can't really figure out a way out of it. Now you have the military at this point continuing to say, we need to either invade Laos, invade North Vietnam, bomb in a much more powerful fashion. But the war will continue to go pretty well for the Americans, certainly for the next several years. And there's still, I think, a pretty strong feeling among the troops that this is something worth fighting for. But there is also this growing realization that the politicians are tying our hands behind our back and not letting us win.
Oh my gosh,
that will increasingly become the sentiment of American troops.
What was the stated war goal? What was the objective for the U.S.?
Well, officially it was to protect South Vietnam against North Vietnamese aggression. You had the model of the Korean War, where you had North Korea invading South Korea, and so the hope was that we could maintain independent South Vietnam. Now, once the American troops go in, again, there is pressure from the military. Let's go into the north. Lyndon Johnson said, well, we tried that in Korea, and the Chinese came in. Now, it turns out to have been a huge miscalculation, because we now know the Chinese, they had taken a terrific beating in Korea, and they said, we're not doing that again. But the United States, again, decides to limit itself to the southern half of the country, and so you're playing defense all the time, and you have an enemy that can keep infiltrating through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Ultimately, the hope is we can build up the South Vietnamese to the point that they can deal with most of this on their own, which will bear some fruit later in the war. Ultimately runs into trouble.
Well, it sounds for younger generations, it feels kind of like Afghanistan. You stabilize it, you train the local people, everything's great, but the moment the American forces aren't there, it reverts to the mean.
Yes, well, I will say that the South Vietnamese government was quite a bit better than what we saw in Afghanistan and Iraq. But on the other hand, the enemy was also much stronger. And the U.S. shot itself in the foot several times in Vietnam in terms of promoting, especially this coup in 1963.
Nice.
You know, I do think
Pretty bad
in the
ending,
case of Vietnam, we
but that's
have
pretty good still.
viable partners. Yeah, a case of Afghanistan, I think clearly that was you know, kind of doomed because we never really found anybody. Of course, as soon as we withdraw our air support,
What? Okay, I need to go.
the South Vietnamese will continue to fight as the U.S. And the Congress pull out aid.
And so you mentioned that it's going pretty well for the first few years. And the first demoralization for the American forces there is the realization that they're not being allowed to go in and do the job that they need to do to win the war. And they're basically sitting ducks just waiting for the Viet Cong to attack rather than going out and cleaning them out, basically.
Yeah, that's right. You know, the initial period is, you know, kind of a emergency rescue operation. You got to push all the North Vietnamese back, and so that's all quite effective. But yeah, after a while, when things just start to drag on, then you do increasingly have people wondering, you know, are we just going to sit here forever? And this is similar to Afghanistan in that you have, you know, Afghanistan. When the Americans were there, we, you know, kill Taliban day after day after day, but they kept coming in from Pakistan, and so, you know, the American people, you know, generally don't have an unlimited patience for that sort of thing, and you know, I think a big part of the problem too was Lyndon Johnson never really made an effort to sell the war. He himself will admit that. He will admit that he was so focused on becoming a domestic policy president, he was going to have the Great Society and civil rights, that if he talked too much about the war, that was going to distract from this. But again, that will lead to some of the, you know, ultimate disillusionment when, you know, if the president's not out there explaining to you why you're fighting, it's hard to understand.
But not only did he not explain why they were fighting, didn't he also downplay the way that the war was going and the casualties that were being incurred as a result of war?
Yeah, I mean, he was certainly...
Going for the win. Look at the determination on his face.
I just flipped the switch. Flip. I don't know nobody else that's doing this. Don't never stop.
Close.
Oh,
never.
gee, y'all.
Oh no, I hate.
Like this one trick. What's up with Mom?
She's been scrolling travel advice for hours. Now she's got influencer brain.
Wonder what this luggage brand sent me? It's luggage. Vocal fry. Time for a glow up. Hashtag paid partner.
That is.
Keep scrolling. Stop scrolling. You gotta use.
Okay, that's pretty
We
cool.
compare hundreds of sites so you always get your trip right. Oh, Mama's back, fam. Illy.
Kayak. Got that right.
Trying to put a positive spin, and, you know, he'll initially is going to be a candidate in 1968 for the presidency, and so he will bring General Westmoreland back to kind of give pep talks and say how things are going well, you know, rather than saying it himself. But this is partly to assure people that, you know, in fact, things are going okay. Then you get to the Tet Offensive, which in 1968, which seems to contradict that. Now, again,
tell us about the Tet Offensive before we talk about this. What happened?
So, in early 1967, the North Vietnamese, and they keep losing battle after battle, and so they at first think things are going well. In early 1967, they finally figure out that they're taking crippling losses and that their own commanders in the South were kind of deceiving them about how things were going because they didn't want to lose face. So they were always claiming they killed all these American South Vietnamese. Somebody finally did the math and said, well, wait, the Americans and South Vietnamese are getting stronger even though you claim you did. So they finally kind of figured out, we got to come up with a new game plan. So since fighting in the remote areas of South Vietnam's not working, what they're going to do is target the cities of South Vietnam, which they've largely left alone, and these are controlled by the government. The thinking is that if we go in there, the people there are going to rise up because they hate the South Vietnamese and American capitalists, and they think it's going to be kind of like in 1945 when they go into Hanoi. So They decided to attack during the Tet holiday, which is the biggest holiday of the year, violating a ceasefire. So they have the element of surprise, but turns out the people are not ready to rise up. In fact, almost none of them do. And so now they're stuck in the cities, and it's not easy for, they're not familiar with the cities, so they don't know where to go. They can't just run away easily. So they take crippling losses at the hands of American and South Vietnamese forces. But you have an American media that focuses on just the magnitude of this, suggesting that they showed that they were stronger than they were, which isn't really the case. But again, Lyndon Johnson has mismanaged the war of ideas, and some of the American hawks say, okay, this is like a Pearl Harbor moment. We can tell the people there was this dastardly surprise attack. Time to really, take the shackles off, send even more troops. But Johnson doesn't want to do that, and so there again, people that you have an opportunity to capitalize on this, let's win the war sentiment. But instead, he decides he doesn't want to do that, and he ends up dropping out of the presidential race, partly because of Vietnam, partly for other reasons.
So reading between the lines of everything you're saying, my sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, is your perspective is you either don't fight, or if you do fight, you fight to win. And the reason that the Vietnam War ended up not being a success is Lyndon Johnson, McNamara, they tried to sit on two stools and ended up falling in between them. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, there's certainly, I think, a lot of truth to that. Now, there were other opportunities too, I think, because one of the central controversies of the war just was it something that could have been won or not. And a lot of historians, especially on the left, will say, no, you could never have won it. Again, I think the Americans could have gone North Vietnam, and maybe there would still been some resistance, but it would have been a much more manageable problem, or that we could have cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But you also do have, towards the end of the war, the U.S. decides to cut off aid to South Vietnam. But South Vietnam is actually getting better over time, and so that was another missed opportunity. And then the one other huge missed opportunity was this coup in 1963. I think had we not done that and sort of torn the government apart, it never would have gotten to the level that it gets to.
And why does America cut off aid to South Vietnam?
Because Congress is getting fed up with the war. It also happens, coincides with Watergate, and so Congress is getting angry at Nixon. Nixon has promised that he'll go help the South Vietnamese, but because of Watergate, his hands are tied, and you have, increasingly large anti-war sentiment within Congress.
Nixon, that's one of the few
things
I have heard.
Has a very benign view of Vietnamese communism, and unduly harsh, I think, view of our Vietnamese allies.
Is that really fair, Mark? Is it possible also that, because of the draft and because the people who are going to fight and die and be maimed in Vietnam are just normal people who didn't volunteer for this, who didn't want to be professional soldiers, that the sentiment among the American public at this point is already turned, or is that not true?
Nixon actually has been very mindful of this, and he actually will end the draft for that reason. And so he does take that issue away. I do think a lot of the hesitation and reluctance is because of the draft issue. In fact, when you look at how the war is written, a lot of the people who dodged the draft end up becoming very harsh critics of the war. But towards the end, it's not a big, the draft is no longer an issue, but it's part of it's just, some people are saying, we're tired of this. We need money for other things. Again, I think a lot of it too was naivete. You have George McGovern is the presidential presidential candidate for the Democrats in 1972, and he's saying Ho Chi Minh is the George Washington of Asia. And you have just incredibly, I think, misguided notions that these Vietnamese communists are nice people. And of course, after the war, they do all sorts of terrible things to clearly show that's not who they are.
I found the perfect gift for your motherhood journey from Blue Nile's Mother's Day collection.
I have a theory that the best summers happen when you have absolutely nothing nagging at the back of your mind. No loose end, no vague sense that you should probably be doing something you're not. Finances are usually somewhere on that list of things quietly nagging. And today's sponsor has actually helped me with that. Monarch is a personal finance app that covers everything: accounts, investments, saving, goals, and spending. Get 50% off your first year with Monarch. Just $50 for the whole year with promo code TRIGGER. I started using it a few months ago, and the first thing it showed me was that a genuinely embarrassing percentage of my monthly spending was going on things that I hadn't really noticed adding up. It's one of those moments where you can't unknow what you're looking at. The AI weekly recap does the monitoring for you and flags anything worth knowing before it becomes a thing worth worrying about. You can ask the AI assistant direct questions about your finances and get a straight answer. There's also an investment view that tracks your portfolio against the S&P 500, which I now check with the same frequency. I probably shouldn't admit it. Use code TRIGGER at monarch.com to get 50% off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarch.com with code TRIGGER. But also as well, we have to say that, you know, the draft and the people who were going to war were blue-collar people, blue-collar men from, you know, deprived backgrounds, working-class backgrounds, etc. And there were plenty of people in the upper classes, the middle classes, who dodged the draft. That must have caused a hell of a lot of resentment.
It did cause some, and and if you look at the numbers, I mean, the lower classes are disproportionately represented. You do have, some of the upper income classes are contributing, but actually there's a big regional divide. So from the southern and western United States, you'll have people of all classes signing up. In the Northeast or the upper Midwest, that's where you tend to find a lot of the more affluent people are finding ways not to go into the military. And that does, I think, certainly cause a lot of friction and distrust and anger, which, I think in some senses is still with us. If you look at the group of Americans from the baby boom who did not go to Vietnam, most of them ended up on the political left and came to dominate the media, academia, play a very important role in our politics.
Because a lot of those people, like you said, they got scarred by this war. Because they see this war, it's a place, Vietnam, most of them have never been. Most of them, if you're going to be honest, probably didn't quite understand what was going on. But then they would see young men being sent away, some of them as young as 17, returning in coffins.
Really? That's
and
great.
Eventually,
Why not?
they think to themselves, not only is this deeply unfair, but what are we getting out of it? Why are our boys dying?
Yeah, and that's why it was so problematic that Lyndon Johnson is not out there explaining to people. And, a lot of his own aides are saying, look what Franklin Roosevelt did in World War II. He was out there telling people why it's important for, our sons to be going over there and risking their lives. And that did a lot to help sustain morale because, it's an enormous risk any family takes or any young man to go, put your life at risk. So it should be something that the people understand and understand its importance. Now, when Richard Nixon comes in, he does. He gives his famous silent majority speech, where he does make a real effort to explain the war to the people, which should have been done long ago. But as I said, I do think actually the pretty strong case should be made of why this war was important, but unfortunately Lyndon Johnson doesn't really make that case.
But it's also as well, there were huge figures at the time like Muhammad Ali, who's no Viet Cong has ever called me the N-word. This huge cultural and sporting figure who refuses the draft on principle. I mean, that's got to have a huge impact, not only on the zeitgeist, but also on the black population as well.
Yeah, so the black population is interesting because in the early years of the war, it's not a big issue for the most part. You do have Martin Luther King coming out, but the American forces in Vietnam are seen as sort of a model of racial integration because you don't have much in the terms of racial friction from 65 to 68. Now, after 68, you increasingly see the influence of the Black Power movement and that causes
Oh, that's cool.
a lot of problems in Vietnam as well as in the U.S. And increasingly, you have this notion that this is a white man's war. And you also have some prominent media actresses, Jane Fonda being the most well-known example, who come out, basically in support of the enemy, and so that, is also very distressing for American troops. A lot of them still will never forgive Jane Fonda. I mean, she goes to North Vietnam and poses with the North Vietnamese anti-aircraft weapons. Basically, looks like she's helping the guys who are trying to shoot at our pilots. So you really have a sense of betrayal that you don't see really in earlier conflicts.
And you mentioned that the perception was eventually that this was a white man's war. Is the implication it's a white man's war being fought by black?
Rewriting your resume till the cows come home? Introducing Indeed Career Scout. Get your resume tailored instantly.
Disproportionately by black people. Is that
well, there will be allegations made like that in around 1967, and at that point, it's interesting too because previously, until the Korean War, blacks were generally kept out of the combat units, and so at least the combat units that were doing in the most difficult parts of the fighting, and so through integration, in some senses it was an advance. Now they're integrated in these combat units, but and I don't know the exact number, something like maybe 15 to 20% in those first few years of the casualties were blacks at a time when they were about 12% of the population. So they are overrepresented. Now, after that becomes an issue, the U.S. actually changes the policy so that there is not this disparity. And so for the war as a whole, the blacks are right around it's right around 12% of the population overall, and they're also 12% of the casualties.
Because there was a lot of talk, and it'd be good to actually delve into this, that there was a real problem with racialization, racism within the armed forces in Vietnam.
Yes, and now having spent a great deal of time looking at that, I think just about any veteran will tell you that this problem was not that big of a deal once you were in the field, because your life depended on cooperation, and so the real friction all took place in the rear areas. You had people with too much time to do. Maybe 10% of American forces are actually out. The rest of them are all in these support units, and so that's where problems are really bad. But you also see this, it's happening all over the world where the U.S. has military bases, Germany, Korea, etc. You have this strong racial antagonism that is really corrosive, starting around 1969.
And when you say starting around, I would assume that the racial antagonism is simply the legacy of the history of slavery and Jim Crow and all the rest of it in this country. Is that what's driving this, or is there a new dimension? You mentioned the Black Power movement, etc.
I do think the Black Power movement is sort of starting to change people's attitudes. You had, for one thing, a lot of the blacks who fight early in the war had volunteered for service. A lot of them, I think, believed in sort of the vision of Martin Luther King, that we want sort of a colorblind society. And, of course, a lot of people, decided, after you have the Civil Rights Act, there's not progress as rapidly as some people might want. And then you start to see, it's a little bit like what we saw, too, with the George Floyd movement more recently, where people say, well, the colorblind society isn't doing enough for us, so we need to take a more radical approach, and one that is more confrontational towards whites.
Because you had problems within the army, there was also problems with drug taking, wasn't there?
Yes, and that also is more prevalent in the rear areas, because again, people kind of know that this could get you killed.
That's faster now.
They may use drugs. They probably won't be doing it in the field. Probably too, because their other soldiers would get really angry at them for doing that because you're putting everyone's lives in jeopardy. But yeah, the drug problem's also getting worse about the same time, and it's very easy to get marijuana, and heroin then also becomes a problem. That, of course, is a much more serious matter, and so there are real problems. It's not the case, I would say, that the U.S. forces are becoming less effective. I mean, there is one thing that's happening in this period that probably does more than either race or drugs to undermine performance, and that is when the Americans start withdrawing under Nixon, you start to have people saying, I don't want to be the last guy to die in Vietnam. And here Nixon does not probably do a good enough job. Although you also will see this in World War II or in Korea, you also have this. Near the end of the war, nobody wants to be like the last guy to die. So you do have morale problems as a result of that in the latter stages.
And you also have scandals going on. So that had a very real impact, particularly on Americans' view of their boys. I mean, there was a scandal with mass happening. So let's talk about that. What were these scandals that really damaged Americans' viewpoint of their army?
Well, the one big war crime was the My Lai massacre, which took place in 1968. And you had a part of a company of American forces went into a village and killed over 400 people. And now it actually was stopped when an American pilot saw this was going on and came in and intervened and then told higher headquarters. But it was a horrific war crime. And now this was done by low-level officers, but officers at a higher level thought that if this word gets out, that this is going to be catastrophic PR nightmare, so let's try to hide it. So they're able to hide it at first, but about a year later, the story comes out. And so that is it was hugely controversial. There's Lieutenant Calley, who's the leading perpetrator, is put on trial, will get convicted. Americans actually kind of divided on this. I mean, some people think that Calley was just being made a scapegoat. Other people thought, Calley fully deserves this. He was doing this. Now, there's then speculation. Maybe this was happening all the time. I think clearly we know it wasn't. This was an aberration. But it does become sort of a rallying call for the anti-war movement and others who are saying, look, we're committing war crimes. I would add too, Americans have committed war crimes. I mean, most wars have some crimes, and oftentimes they don't get as much publicity. But this one, they have pictures that are circulated, and so it is very harmful for the American cause. And then you have the Pentagon Papers, where Daniel Ellsberg releases this study that he put together, actually under the Johnson administration. Now, it doesn't come out till Nixon's president, but it does reveal some of the deceit and mistakes that were committed.
Takis, the snack of the most intense fans.
By people like McNamara and Johnson. And all the disastrous errors that came from that. So that will certainly provoke a lot of controversy. Nixon himself is not covered in the Pentagon Papers, and at first he's kind of thinks, I'll just let this go. But then Henry Kissinger, who is his his national security advisor, tells him that we have to figure out who did this and punish them ruthlessly, and that there's actually probably a conspiracy involved in all of this.
Can I just pause you there, Mark?
Yes.
Because we didn't skip over, but we kind of didn't really delve into what the Pentagon Papers actually said. What were the accusations? What were the mistakes made? What were the crimes that were committed? And then we can come back to this bit, which is Kissinger and saying we need to punish our enemies and the people who did this.
Yeah, so the Pentagon Papers expose the American role in the coup of 1963. And at the time, up until this time, it wasn't clear what role the Americans had actually played. But now, these make clear that, in fact, the U.S. Embassy is supporting this coup. The CIA is involved, and so that was, quite disconcerting for a lot of people on both the right and the left who are wondering why are we actually overthrowing this allied government of ours. You have information about the Tonkin Gulf suggesting that maybe it was not quite what we were told, that in fact there was some provocation involved. You have documents indicating about that they're actually planning to go to war when Lyndon Johnson's saying that he's the peace candidate. And then you have talk of the war strategy. And one thing we haven't talked about yet is Robert McNamara had what he called the strategy of gradual escalation. And this again goes back to these game theories that he's pulled from academia. But he argues that when we start bombing North Vietnam in early 1965, we should start off at a low level and build
early in the morning.
And that's part of our plan to communicate our intent and also to limit our risk. Now, the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the same time, this also comes out in the Pentagon Papers, the Joint Chiefs of Staff are saying, no, that's crazy. Let's hit him hard right away. And so clearly the strategy of gradual escalation doesn't work. And in fact, what happens is it gives the North Vietnamese time to build up their anti-aircraft defenses. So you have a lot of strategic incompetence being exposed here in the Pentagon Papers.
Right, I'm going to level with you. I'm not a gamer, even though I look like one. I'm not going to pretend I've been grinding through RPGs between recordings, or that I have strong opinions about which Final Fantasy was the best one. I think it's Japanese, and I think there's a sword. That's genuinely everything I know. But our social media guy showed me this app, and I genuinely thought that's quite clever. It's called Snacksy. Basically, game publishers need new players, and they're willing to pay to get them. Snacksy just passes that money on to you. You play games you were probably going to play anyway, you earn coins, and you cash them out for real rewards. PayPal, Amazon, Netflix, gift cards. If you prefer gaming credit, you can redeem for PlayStation, Xbox, Steam, and Nintendo, or cash out your Aniba wallet. I've got no idea what that means. Actual money, not just points that expire. It takes a few minutes to set up. You open the app, swipe through the game offers, pick something that looks decent, play it, earn, redeem. That's the whole thing. There's a sign-up bonus worth up to $10 if you use our link in the description of this episode. That's SNAKZY, Snacksy. Click the link in the description to get started, and when you sign up, use the code TRIGGERPOD. That's TRIGGERPOD to claim your $10 bonus. And the app is mobile.
Damn, I was almost
so click the link from your phone, not your laptop.
And Mark, this takes us into the realm of Hollywood, which actually is a big part of this, but probably after the war. But one of the things that's been depicted in a number of movies, one of them, I think, American Gangster, with Denzel Washington, is the idea that actually the Vietnam War becomes a big drug trafficking operation, and a lot of drugs are coming to the United States through that. A lot of the army is involved, the CIA is involved. How much truth is there to that?
I think a lot of it's been exaggerated, probably some truth to it. I mean, a lot of the drugs taking place are just taking place within that theater. They're not going back and forth necessarily with the United States. I mean, it does get a little murky when the U.S. is supporting various groups in Laos and Cambodia that are also involved in the drug trade, and so it sometimes looks like the U.S. is supporting them. A lot of that's the CIA side of it. Still, actually, we don't know that much about it. They don't release records on those things. But yeah, I don't think it's probably as serious as people might imagine.
Hollywood's dramatizing things.
It is.
Wow.
Yes. Yeah. Hollywood hasn't done a very good job on Vietnam.
Well, we'll talk about that. But
Yeah.
before we get there, take us through to the end of the war. We've got to this point where the morale is dipping. The soldiers on the ground are starting to realize we can't actually win because the politicians won't let us. Eventually, the rot sets in. The American media is on it. You've got these racial tensions. Morale is dropping further. As you said, no one wants to be the last guy to die in Vietnam. What happens then, and how do we get through to the American withdrawal?
And just before, probably we'll do with the Kissinger, actually go and punish the enemies, then get to that point.
Okay. Yeah. So so after the Ellsberg disclosures are made, so Ellsberg turned himself in, but Henry Kissinger and others tell Nixon, that there may be a broader conspiracy here. It might involve some State Department people, some think tanks. And so Nixon decides to set up a group that will become known as the Plumbers to go find out and dig dirt on these people. And so one of the people they target initially is a psychiatrist of Daniel Ellsberg. And they go and raid his apartment with, without really proper legal clearance. They end up not finding anything, but this will become important because it basically sets the stage for the actual Watergate break-in, which is what's going to take Nixon down ultimately. And so Nixon...
if you want to push it out and like really get it out there, make sure you film it.
Oh.
And you'll definitely want to host and invite lots of guests. But if you want it to grow, you'll need to make short versions of it and put them all over social.
If your podcast is overdue, just start talking. Riverside does the rest. No labor, just love.
So he gives a silent majority speech in November of '69. 1970, there's a coup in Cambodia, throws out the pro-communist leader, and the U.S. then decides to go into Cambodia to help the Cambodian government, which is useful in reducing sanctuary. And one of the things we find out is that the Cambodian port of Sihanoukville was a massive hub for North Vietnamese supplies coming in, so we're able to shut that down. So that means the only place really they're getting supplies is Laos. So the next year, 71, Nixon supports a South Vietnamese effort, to all South Vietnamese forces, to go in, and they have a big fight. It's not as successful as they want, but it has short-term benefit, buys time. In 1972, the North Vietnamese decide they're going to launch a huge offensive. This is 14 divisions. This is clearly far beyond any sort of guerrilla war, and it's almost all North Vietnamese coming into the South. At this point, American ground troops are gone, but U.S. air power is there and inflicts a crushing defeat on the North Vietnamese. And so this is one of the indicators that the South Vietnamese are getting their act together, that they can fight off 14 divisions without American ground troops. Now then what happens is you have a peace agreement in the late 72 that is really, I think, mismanaged by Kissinger. What Kissinger ends up doing is cutting a deal that allows the North Vietnamese troops to stay in South Vietnam. And South Vietnamese go crazy when they hear this. And Nixon was actually doing this without telling the South Vietnamese. And so there's a huge conflict between the Americans and the South Vietnamese. And then the North Vietnamese are also...
Why does Kissinger do that?
He, I think, partly didn't realize how bad of an idea it was.
Really?
Yes. He also, so Nixon for a while, he's been trying to sort of cement his legacy as, a great diplomat. And so, and it's, if you look at other diplomatic endeavors, it's actually not all that similar. Some people get so obsessed with the deal that they just start giving things away just so they can say they struck the deal. And what ultimately happens is, so the South Vietnamese complain, then Kissinger goes back to the North Vietnamese and says, well, we kind of need to change what we agreed to, because maybe that wasn't such a great idea. And but the North Vietnamese say, well,
no, I wasn't.
You already agreed to.
I wasn't.
So then Nixon bombs them in what's called the Christmas bombing, very heavy bombing in December of '72. And Nixon easily thinks, we're going to, clobber North Vietnam. They're going to be hurt for so long, and they won't be able to do anything, at least not for a while. And we're going to, declare this peace agreement. And he promises the South Vietnamese that he will protect them if the North Vietnamese, in fact, do launch another big offensive. Now, whether he was going to actually live up to that, we don't know, because he's gone by '74. The South Vietnamese, basically the peace never really happens. The South Vietnamese are fighting North Vietnamese, and it's going pretty well until about the middle of '74, when the American, the aid cuts by the Congress are taking effect. So now South Vietnamese don't have enough fuel.
Oh my God. I beat my
defense
defense.
like South Vietnam, you need aircraft.
Probably not
you don't
enough,
have
right? Yeah.
ammunition, and this gradually gets worse and worse. And so the North Vietnamese see this and launch an offensive in early 75, and they kind of wait to see, too, are the Americans going to come do anything? By this time, Nixon's gone, the Americans don't do anything, and so the North Vietnamese then are able to, with 600,000 troops, defeat this depleted South Vietnamese force.
When you tell the story and you outline it like this, it does sound more and more, and something that I didn't appreciate through watching the movies, and we'll come on to that, it just sounds like political and strategic incompetence. But what you said about Kissinger, I mean, to me that just blows my mind. I mean, this was obviously a fantastically intelligent man. I'm not the brightest, but even I can work out leaving the enemy in the cities isn't a good idea.
Yeah, that's right, and he will catch a lot of heat. Yeah, as you said, he was a brilliant man. That's McNamara also, again, brilliant guy, but yet they commit some terrible strategic blunders, which, again, I think this was not a foregone conclusion that it was going to end the way it did. You had both of those guys making, very terrible decisions. Now, you also had McNamara and Nixon who, listened to these guys, and I think that's part of the problem is they thought, well, these guys are so smart, they must know what they're talking about. Now, we do know in the case of McNamara, Johnson actually, near the end of his presidency, concludes that McNamara doesn't know what he's talking about because McNamara wants to, in late 67, cut the bombing because he says the bombing's really not doing anything. But there's so much information that says it's, in fact, doing things that, McNamara has become diluted. And, Nixon also, Kissinger commits some huge and costly mistakes. I mean, another thing he does is he comes up with this whole agreement with the North Vietnamese before he even shows it to the South Vietnamese, and then the keeping the North Vietnamese troops there is not the only huge problem they have in there. And Kissinger didn't even appreciate that some of the language in the document. The Vietnamese are very attuned to language, and he had signed off on these terms that he had no idea that the Vietnamese were going to attach some importance. For example, how do you describe the demilitarized zone between North and South? The U.S. didn't think it was a big deal, but the semantics of this were huge to both Vietnamese, and so he just tied the U.S. to this deal that had all these problems without even getting the concurrence of our allies, and it just it just did not go at all well.
So the war was fought because of the domino theory, the idea that if you let Vietnam get overrun by communists, communism will spread in Asia. Well, Vietnam does get overrun by communists. Was domino theory correct?
Trident vibes. It's soft. It's juicy. A soft gum with a juicy experience. It's a vibe.
Yes, great question. So I think it's first worthwhile. One of the big problems with the Vietnam War is oftentimes people don't understand the different phases. I mean, it goes from 60 to 75, and a lot of times people think the world's kind of static, but in fact, the world's vastly different.
That was way faster.
When the U.S. goes in than when South Vietnam's overrun 75. What you see in 65 is that, in fact, there are lots of countries under threat from communism.
Okay,
the most important one, which
it's a bit
get its due attention, is Indonesia. At this time, there's a civil war brewing between Sukarno, who is a communist essentially, and his military, and that will actually come to a head in September of 65, and the military will end up overthrowing Sukarno, but they will actually say later that the reason they took the stand was because they realized the Americans were not bailing out. And had we given up on South Vietnam, I mean, no country.
Like I had to go to that trajectory. I had a better trajectory.
And then leave when the going gets rough. So it was actually, I think, very important in the case of Indonesia, also Thailand, Singapore. Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew, it's very explicitly come out and said that Vietnam bought time for Southeast Asia to solidify and build up its strength against communism. And another thing that happens is American intervention will drive North Vietnam and China apart for a few reasons. One, as I mentioned, there's now all the Soviet aid's coming in. American intervention also, I think, plays a role in the Cultural Revolution in China in 1966, which, Mao had thought he had this big period of expansion in Vietnam and Indonesia. Both those get crushed, and he now turns inward for enemies, and he loses interest in international affairs. And so by the time you get to 75, Chinese and North Vietnamese have turned against each other, and in fact, they'll fight a war in 1979. So most of the dominoes don't fall, but Cambodia and Laos fall. So those are significant. And it's also worth noting, this leads then to the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, who kill some 2 million people in this genocidal conflict, which again, I think worth keeping in mind that this is a fanatical ideology. Vietnamese also kill a lot of their own people. Most of it goes under the radar. But I think ultimately the U.S., while it ultimately loses South Vietnam, it holds on to a lot of other Asian countries, which today are actually the main U.S. allies in this ongoing competition with China.
And again, reading between the lines of what you're saying, it sounds to me like your view, and of course there'll be historians who disagree on this, but your view, I guess, is it was the right war to fight, it was just fought in the wrong way. Is that fair?
That's correct, yes, and that is, and those are, really, the central issues of the war, and, unfortunately, so politicized in this country that to make that argument is sort of radioactive in American academia.
It's called the show is called Trigonometry for a reason.
Yeah.
By the way, I honestly didn't know that was going to be your perspective. You were just you were recommended to us by a friend, and really interested in your thoughts on it. So it's an interesting perspective. It's one I have heard from other people, and as you say, it is very toxic. And I imagine that is partly because, well, look, it might not be true. There will be people who say it's not true, but also I think because of just how powerful the Hollywood narrative that was created after the war was. And I'm not saying that narrative is false. I'm not qualified to assess whether it's true or false. What I'm saying is, even as someone who's not American, who wasn't brought up in America, if I had to tell you what the story
I actually beat it. Nice.
It would be, Platoon. It would be, what's the
Fourth of July.
Oh, I'm actually better. Okay.
Those are not positive war movies. Right. You're not looking at that going, we're the good
I
guys.
think it's fine. Yeah, we can go on to
that. And the country very much split along political lines.
Wait, actually,
Reagan, described this as a noble cause, but most people have taken the view that it was unnecessary, unwinnable. And a big part in my view of why the left pushed that so hard is that what's interesting, look what's going on in college campuses in the middle of the 60s. When the U.S. goes into Vietnam, there's actually very little protest. Again, this is one of those areas where it's worth keeping in mind the chronology. The protests don't start till 1967, and it coincides exactly with the reduction of draft deferments for students, for college students. And so suddenly, and I'm not the first person to say, but I think it's true that a lot of this opposition is driven by the fact that when you tell these college students didn't care that much about the war until they said, well, we're going to send you there. And now some of them don't want to go. And if you look at the nation's history, it's almost always the case that the manly thing, the civic thing to do is to go when your country calls you. So if you're going to not go...
They say higher education is outdated, irrelevant. But at Grand Canyon University, we shatter the status quo. GCU's online master's degree programs in technology combine hands-on projects with coursework to help you innovate across digital and physical environments.
At GCU, you can learn to use technology with faith, integrity, and purpose.
This is purpose-driven education. Take action. Find your purpose at Grand Canyon University. Visit gcu.edu.
Life comes at you fast, whether you're ready for it or not.
I've been so many places in my life and time.
Some people leave your life and never come back.
I've sung a lot of songs.
That was really fast.
everything has to come to an end. It's a part of life. Nothing. It's for
and not answer the country's call, you have to come up with a reason. And so the reason is this was a terrible war and we never should have fought it. And again, I think much of this is for self-serving reasons. And if you actually look into the facts of the war, they don't bear those things out.
A little bit of pushback to that. So I have American friends, and I know some people who've actually, Vietnam veterans, one whose father committed suicide, came back completely damaged because of what he saw. Young man ended up killing himself before the age of 30. Another one had addiction issues. I think as well we need to acknowledge, Mark, that there was a very real psychological scar that was imprinted amongst a generation of young men, particularly blue-collar working-class young men.
Well, I think there's certainly cases of that. Now, it is interesting, polls that have been done, Vietnam veterans, there was a survey done a few years after the war, and about 90% of them said they were actually proud of their service. And now, most of those people also said the problem was that we tied our hands behind our back. So again, they did have gripes, but it was about how it was fought. Now, you know, the question of psychological damage is an interesting one too, because you have the rise of certain psychiatrists who are arguing that there is some unique mental illness, and we're going to call PTSD, that's coming out of Vietnam. I think that's mostly been debunked just in that if you look at any war, there are people with these same problems coming back. Probably a little bit worse, given that when people came home, they weren't greeted as heroes. I would say that. But, you know, any war, I mean, if you talk with veterans of World War II or Korea or, you know, Afghanistan, I mean, there's a lot of veterans coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq who have committed suicide as well, tragically. But, yeah, I think it's worth keeping in mind that, you know, in many senses, it's not really not any worse of a war than most of the wars we've fought, because, you know, all the wars we've fought have been pretty awful. But again, when you compare the Hollywood version of World War II movies don't look quite like Platoon or, you know, Apocalypse Now.
Look, I'll be honest with you, I was skeptical. A green powder that claims to do everything sounds exactly like something I'd tear apart. I've seen enough people pushing miracle solutions to know what that looks like. I take AG1 every morning.
Why does he have so many sponsors?
Out of habit if they're not delivering. One scoop in water, that's it. Over 75 vitamins, minerals, and nutrients designed to support your energy, mood, and digestion. For someone juggling the podcast, writing, travel, and trying to stay sharp enough to hold my own in the conversations we have on this show, that foundation matters to me. I'm not dragging myself through the afternoons the way I used to. With AG1, I feel like I'm actually running on a full tank, and this isn't just marketing copy. AG1 is clinically backed. Every study on their website is openly available for you to read. If you're a trigonometry listener, you don't take things on faith, so go and look at the evidence yourself. That transparency is part of why I trust it. So if you care about thinking clearly and staying on top of your game, try AG1 for yourself at drinkag1.com/trig. And with your first month subscription, you'll get 10 travel packs, a bottle of vitamin D3 plus K2, and a welcome kit that includes your scoop and shaker completely free. Again, to get this offer, go to drinkag1.com/trig or click the link in the description of this episode. Give it a go. And do you think the Vietnam War has made a profound impact on how America sees wars moving forward?
I do, and I think, you know, the left and the right took different lessons. I mean, the left's lesson was basically we want to stay out of wars, and the left pretty much stuck with that, you know, for decades. And, you know, every time a war came, they said, this is another Vietnam. And it's been interesting with Ukraine. Suddenly they've now become the party of war. You know, they were actually you know, they got us into several wars in the 20th century. You know, the political right, you know, came out with the message that if you're going to fight, you fight to win. And so we saw in the first Gulf War, the Bush administration was very intent on saying, you know, we're going to use maximum force, and it worked there. Now, then you get to Afghanistan, Iraq. you know, in both of those cases, I think the U.S. didn't really know what was coming. Weren't even expecting a war. We thought a protracted war, and and neither of those went quite as expected.
Yeah, you
and
can say that.
Yeah. So I think that's what's you know.
I was going to ask you about that, because do you think the Vietnam War and the portrayal of it, rightly or wrongly, in the media, in Hollywood, among a lot of people in the country as well, it's the template onto which the failure of Afghanistan and the failure of Iraq fit very nicely? Because I hinted at this right at the beginning of our conversation. I kind of it's strange for us, because we're not immersed in American culture nearly as much.
Nice.
When we look at conflicts that are happening now,
that is really good.
Israel, and the left and right split in different ways on those issues, both within and against each other, etc. But you hear
55
say this thing like,
and even doing
Ukraine, or we're not sending American boys, which is kind of like weird in the current context, because that really isn't remotely what's happening in either of those conflicts. Nor is it the direction of travel, nor does the United States have a draft. So even if America did put boots on the ground, which it has no intention of doing, they would be people who volunteered for that. But the cultural dominance of this thing of like, we're not dying for a foreign country, does that come from Vietnam?
There's a lot about the job that isn't actually that fun that I have now automated away.
I think on the left, but it's been interesting on the right. That was not, as I said, that was not the main message that the right took. The right took away the message that you fight to win. It's not that you just don't fight. Whereas I think in recent times, mainly I think because of Iraq and Afghanistan, you increasingly hear people on the right who are questioning whether we should get involved in these interventions. But again, I think the right now is thinking more in terms of Iraq, Afghanistan, how those things were costly, and again, at a time when we've got rampant inflation, people here, conscious of how much we spend abroad, and so there is a lot of reluctance, and I think there is, and within the Republican Party, of which I'm part, there's been this big split between the neoconservatives and sort of the neo-isolationists. The neocons kind of get blamed for Iraq and Afghanistan, and they were kind of the principal architects. And so now you've had this, this other element that's very hostile to them. There's also, I think, in between those, a large group, which I would say maybe sort of the Reagan conservatives, who are, sort of not either super eager to get in every war, but also, not necessarily opposed to war and willing to fight when American interests are at stake.
Well, as an outsider, that does seem like the smart position, because those two other extremes, the neocon wars of the 2000s don't seem to me to have been beneficial to anybody, especially America. Say nothing of the people that were killed, etc. And the neo-isolationist position, or the isolationist position, seems to me a little bit naive. We had a big debate about this with a guy called Dave Smith, who's very popular representing that point of view. Because if you are going to be the most powerful country in the world, you are going to have to control territory beyond your own borders, and sometimes that means getting physical. So to go so far in other extremes seems kind of incompatible with America being the most powerful country in the world.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I do think there is some naivete. And and I have debates with people. I kind of consider myself in the middle on this, but there are some who would say, well, yes, having a military is important for deterrence purposes. What we should do is just have a big military, but then we never use it. But I don't think you can really have deterrent power if you take that position, because people are going to call your bluff, or if you're out there, advertising this. So, sometimes, as you said, if it's the world's greatest power, sometimes you are actually going to have to do something, or you're not going to be the world's greatest power, especially if we have this rising China. I do think we also see today what we saw before is that American politicians have not done a good job explaining to the American people why Ukraine or Israel or whatever other causes why this is actually so important to us. And you know, I spent a lot of time teaching college students, and that's one of the things they say. They don't really understand, you know, why are we spending all this money here? But it hasn't really been explained to us.
And how do you explain it to your students?
Well, you know, I think both of them are tricky issues. They're not as compelling as the case you have for Vietnam. I mean, I think in the case of Ukraine, we obviously still have great interests in Europe. You know, it's not a, you know, if Eastern Europe gets unsettled, we have, you know, problems of migration, which of course that's a big issue here. Potentially, you know, Russia could keep pushing westward, though I'm not convinced that Russia's going to ever go attack Poland, but, you know, there is also the sort of human element that you have, you know, mass killings of civilians, and at some point, you know, as the world's greatest power, that's something we may not want to be willing to tolerate.
I'm not hearing much strategic interest for the United States in that explanation, though.
Right, well, that's the thing, too, is I think it's harder to make the case for strategic interest, which is perhaps part of why, you know, you don't hear a lot of people in Washington make that case. I mean, the other reality you have is, you know, we now have a situation where Russia seems to be just using attrition, and they've sort of calculating on their larger population that they're eventually going to grind Ukraine down, which I think would just, you know, be terrible for all concerned. So, yeah, I mean, my own view is ultimately need to find some kind of solution to stop this, which probably means, you know, the Ukrainians may have to give some things up, which is not great either. I mean, you don't want to set the precedent for, you know, countries taking territory and then keeping it, but it's really, to me, just a nasty problem without a lot of, you know, very good solutions at this point. You know, I think, you know, the Biden administration, I remember a couple of years ago, they thought that the Ukrainians were going to, you know, prevail militarily, and you know the Russians did very poorly at the beginning, and so I think they thought that was going to continue. Well, it's not, and so I think they miscalculated. And
well, the weird position of the Biden administration is like, Ukraine is going to win, but we're not going to give them the weapons to do it. So,
Yes.
so it's like, well, they could have won maybe, or look, it depends on, you know, the Ukrainian flag's not going to be flying over the Kremlin anytime soon, but they could have pushed Russia back to the 1991 borders. Now, unlikely, but
Yeah.
if you've given them proper support, they might have done that. But you can't. But it sort of was like it was all pom poms and no actual support.
Yes.
It wasn't zero, but it wasn't the support that they needed.
Yeah.
So this is kind of how I certainly think, and I'm from Russia and I have a lot of Ukrainian family, how we've ended up where we are. What about Israel and the war against Hamas? How do you talk to your students about that?
Well, that's an interesting one too, because they are.
There are trucks, and then there's the 2026 GMC Sierra.
Historically, the Republican Party has been pretty strongly pro-Israel. It's much more divided now, and I think partly because, well, certainly, you know, we have some very influential figures on the right who are kind of questioning this from the national interest perspective. You know, exactly.
But does America have a national interest in being allied with Israel?
With being allied with Israel, yes. I think the harder point, what people struggle with more is, you know, do we have a national interest sort of supporting what's going on in Gaza? I mean, but I mean, I think even on the question in terms of is it our national interest, I think that one's, you know, something's been debated too. I mean, you probably saw there's a big flap with the president of the Heritage Foundation a week or so ago. You know, so clearly there's a lot of conflict around this. I think.
Well, by the time this episode goes out, everyone will have forgotten about Kevin Roberts, who we've had on the show, by the way. But what I'm asking is, what is the strategic interest for the United States in being allied with Israel? Forget about Gaza. That's where the conversation on the right in America really is, and by the way, on the left too, I think. Why is America allied with Israel?
Well, a lot of it, I think, you know, has to do with history. I mean, there's a sense in this country still, although again, this is sort of fading, that you know, in the aftermath of World War II, you know, after all that was inflicted on the Jewish people, that they deserve to have a homeland and a place, you know, where they could live in safety. You know, we've always also had this competing view. Well, we also want to be friends with the the Arab countries and the Islamic countries around them. You know, I think this was easier case to make when we were, U.S. was more concerned about the Middle East. We had these fears of terrorism, that, you know, Israel's an ally in terms of dealing with the terrorist threat. But I think that's partly why it's harder to get support now, because, you know, most Americans, I don't think, now think about terrorism in the same way. You know, I think also there is, you know, in terms of, we consider Iran to be one of our top enemies, which, you know, makes sense. It clearly, Israel is critical in terms of keeping those guys in check.
Mark, doesn't it also represent what we're talking about, the scars of Vietnam, and that there's a lot of people in this country who simply don't trust government because they go, you've lied to me repeatedly, you lied to me over Vietnam, and it's just gone right the way, weapons of mass destruction. Why should I believe you? Why should I believe a single word you say about Israel, Ukraine, or anything else?
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. I mean, certainly you hear a lot of that coming out, and not just Vietnam, but also, you know, Watergate reinforces this. And I said the Pentagon Papers are part of this because clearly people are being lied to. Now, I do think it's exaggerated. You know, some people say, well, up until Vietnam, America trusts its leaders. Well, if you actually go back and look at your history, Americans have always had a certain suspicion of our leaders, you know, going back to, you know, George III. So I don't think it's quite the case that we just, you know, never thought that our, you know, leaders would lie. I mean, you know, if you look in the early republic too, they're flinging all sorts of mud and, you know, saying how the other sides are all a bunch of scoundrels. So I think it goes in cycles too. I mean, yes, in the 90s, and that's partly what, you know, when you get to the first Gulf War, there is, you know, a lot of people think, okay, well, yes, there are weapons of mass destruction, and they seem to know what they're doing. But again, obviously, that turned out to be huge. And so now we're back in one of those periods of deep distrust. And yeah, I'm not sure what gets you out. I mean, I think it could be a president who, you know, I think that's one of Ronald Reagan's big accomplishments, is that he was the kind of person who could help restore a certain degree of trust in the government. And I don't think we've really had a figure since then in this country who's been able to do that.
The thing is, the media environment is now so different. Social media, podcasting, the plurality of voices as such. And also, you know, as I said, this episode will go out some time ago, but we just had a story in the UK, and who knows if the BBC still exists by the time where this conversation's aired, because, I mean, we now know that large swathes of the media, and I say this as no fanboy of President Trump. You know, I think he's great on some things and not so great on other things, but they lied so much about him. They literally did election interference while accusing him of election interference, that it's just hard for people, I think, to trust media they don't already agree with, you know?
Yes, I think, and certainly there's been great distrust in this country, and actually Vietnam really saw, I think probably the first time you had very deep distrust of the media among some parts, because it clearly became
Kayak smart filters help me find the perfect hotel room. And we're on our way. Nothing's gonna stop us today. Yeah, we're on our way. If you look deeper.
evident that the media was increasingly monolithic ideology, and clearly left of center, and so conservatives, you know, complained for a long time. There really actually wasn't much recourse, and when you have Fox News and the internet, it's actually changed things a lot because people have other sources of news to go to, and which I think is important. But yeah, I mean, it is unfortunate, and I think I think in this country gave up a while ago on hoping for something more impartial, which I guess the BBC still strives to be. But you know, our media here, pretty much is either left or right. And I always tell students you want to listen to both to make sure you're getting the information, but a lot of people only listen to the side they agree with, which isn't healthy.
No, it's not. And, you know, Constantine and I always talk about this. And forgive me because it might be slightly offensive to our American viewers and listeners, but you bloody love a conspiracy theory here. You are the nation of conspiracy theories. Whenever you sit down with somebody, doesn't matter how smart they are, what side of the political spectrum, they all go, you know who's really in charge? Like, how much of that really is to do with Vietnam? Where expose after expose after expose, people lying. I mean, that government gaslit a nation whilst they're at war. That's got to have an effect. And then weapons of mass destruction again. That has got to make a population more conspiratorial.
I mean, now you do have a good number of conspiracies before Vietnam on the political right in terms of, although, you know, what was sometimes seen as communist conspiracies actually have been validated to have been true. But yeah, I mean, you certainly see a rise in the distrust of government and a willingness to believe that the government is going to do bad things. And I think it did subside for a time. I will tell you, more recently, things that might have been some kind of conspiracy theory. Crossfire Hurricane is an example of, the government's actually doing some crazy things, and you think there's no way the government is actually going to do this. And I personally tend not to believe in conspiracy theories, but at the same time, when you see something like that, you say, my God.
Tell us about that a little bit. What was that?
That was surrounding in the 2016 campaign, the FBI, and this was when Obama was still in power, they, used this so-called Steele dossier, which had all these crazy allegations against Trump, which turned out to be false. They used that to open FBI investigations into Trump's associates. And some of this is still being sort of pushed out now by the new government. But you have, the FBI basically being used to try to interfere with the 2016 campaign, and very senior FBI officials, and some of them, end up getting fired. I mean, Kevin Kleinsmith, this is one I like to tell my Democratic friends. I'll say, tell me who Kevin Kleinsmith is. Most of them don't even know, but he was, this FBI official who falsifies a warrant to spy on the Trump campaign. And there's, Peter McCabe, or Andrew McCabe, excuse me, he gets fired by, so there's actually quite a few of these very senior FBI officials who were caught up in this. And so things like that, I think, have made certainly the right, and I think partly what you're seeing on the right is sort of a backlash against this, and a broader sense. Yes, the government is broken and it needs radical surgery. Now, how you actually fix it tends to be a little more difficult than destroying the bad parts.
Because what we also saw, and it was, people stopped talking about it because of the tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk, but people kind of forget that before that, the big story was Epstein. And it looked like the Jeffrey Epstein scandal was going to do significant damage to Donald Trump's presidency. And you go, look, well, obviously the Epstein scandal was a big thing, but why this and everything else? And to me, it was the conspiratorial element that was almost making people lose their minds. Like, they couldn't get past that.
Yeah, I do think, this is one area I think the internet's been problematic, because theories like this would not have been spread 30 years ago in the way they are. But we now have, again, partly because, people just go to where they like to get their information, and they tune out things that might contradict that. And so, yeah, I mean, certainly it's been incredible how much play that issue, the Epstein issue, has been receiving. Now, again, a lot of other people aren't paying much attention to it, but, and of course, you also saw with the Charlie Kirk thing, you have all these conspiracy theories about who was involved in that as well. So it is an unfortunate element of our politics.
Well,
what are you so worried about?
I guess I'm worried that it won't sound any good.
Well, I didn't even finish soundproofing my room.
It's been great having you on. Thank you so much for talking to us. Before we head over to our Substack, where our audience get to ask you their questions, what's the one thing we're not talking about that we really should be?
Yeah, I'd say the question of public ethics in this country is something we don't talk enough about. Now, people are getting very spun up about corruption scandals, and rightly so, but
you had some experience yourself with all of this.
I did, yes, in the first Trump administration, and I became a whistleblower essentially by reporting corruption, and then they came after me, and I certainly saw a deficit of ethics in our government, and this is part of a broader cultural problem. Historically, this country is talking about ethics in terms of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Some of our population still does, but we also have large segments who want to be so secular that we can't talk about any of that stuff, and they assume that through some sort of cosmopolitanism we can still maintain a culture of ethics. But from my experience, ethics isn't something that just arises out of thin air. This is actually a problem, and we see a lot of unethical behavior in our society. If we really want our government to cause us less harm, we probably need to figure out our cultural, social, religious moorings so that we are actually behaving ourselves better.
All right, Mark, thanks so much for joining us. Head on over to triggerpod.co.uk where you get to ask Mark your questions. To what extent did Nixon and Kissinger sabotage the Democrats' peace negotiations ahead of the '68 election? And to what extent does Mark think they should be held as culpable for tens of thousands of potentially unnecessary deaths in the years that followed?
My boyfriend makes $250,000 a year, but he does not want to propose until I'm completely debt-free.
So he's making $250,000 a year. He's balling. Probably one of my viewers.
He does not want to propose until I'm completely debt-free.
You're not gonna like me.
I am.
If you were my daughter, you wanna know what I would tell you?
What?
Dump him.
Wait,
No, he's
what?
Yeah, I mean, he's a great guy.
No, he's not. No, he's not.
He's
he's
making you prove your worth.
Absolutely. I'm going to explain the reason why I'm surprised he even said that. Because this is a test. If she can't even manage her own finances, if you're married, now you share finances. Why would you want to entangle yourself with a person who has been proven that they're going to fuck themselves up? I'm actually surprised. I see a bald-ass old man like this, and I thought he was going to say what I was about to say. That's why people are mad. He never says this to men. He wants to say, like, oh, but it's different if it's a man and a woman, right? And, like, in a way, yeah, you shouldn't hold women to the same standards you hold men to. But the problem is that the government does. So you can't be traditional in that way whenever the government says it's 50-50.
You're having to buy your way into this relationship.
Buy your way?
You're a princess and you deserve more than this.
He's got to be joking.
The reason I've been able to, like, put, like, majority of my paycheck towards my loans is because he does pay for all our rent.
Oh, so you live together?
Yeah, we live together.
Oh, so you're already married, but you just didn't admit it.
Yeah, it does feel like we're married.
Well, that...
Yeah.
Gosh,
yeah. So what's his incentive to get married? None.
He could just be an idiot today, and he just needs to learn a little bit about what it means to be in a relationship.
I love you, and if you were my daughter, I'd tell you not to marry this guy.
You know what? In a way, I agree with him. She needs to find another guy out there that's also $19,000 in debt, so they can get married and be $40,000 in debt. You say 90,000? Wait, hold up. What did it say? 90?
I have about $90,000 left.
And so you got 90,000 left.
90? Wait, so she's 90,000? I totally disagree with Baldy. Crazy to even expect that, man. It's like, you're a princess, you deserve better. This dude is making $250,000 a year, and you're calling into a fucking internet show to complain about him. You got this bitch sitting in your house. She is in your house that you paid for. You're paying for fucking everything.
The reason I've been able to, like, put, like, majority of my paycheck towards my loans is because he does pay for all our rent.
And she's crying to somebody on the internet looking for attention because you don't want to pay. Oh my God. This girl better be really hot. Maybe you could say this is an investment, but what if she's fat? Dave, don't ever take on debt for any reason. Also, Dave, you don't want to take on $90,000 of someone else's debt, you should die.
That's not that much.
These damn boomers, man, they're genuinely the worst. Just take on $90,000 of her debt, bro. If the roles were reversed, Dave would be calling the guy a bum.
I don't know. I'm gonna do